All right, class. All right, class. Y'all, welcome back. Welcome back. Even though I'm not there to see you today, I am glad everybody made it back to class. This, for most of us, is the start of a brand new week. So, as always, it's my number one concern when I send you all out that you come back to me safe and sound. Y'all, thanks for being safe. Thanks for being smart, or at least smart enough to make it back to class. Y'all, again, I might not be there to see everybody, but I am happy that everybody was safe enough and smart enough to make it back after the weekend. So I hope, even though I'm not in front of you, that you're giving the sub the attention and respect they deserve. And if you're in a class with Mr. Arnold, you better be giving him the attention and respect he deserves. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to take care of our big set of notes over what is called the Great Depression. Now, I know I've made this joke before, but the Great Depression is not the name of this school, even though some of you treat this school as if it is the greatest depression of your lives. The Great Depression is what we call this time period in American history that is the worst economic times America had ever gone through and experienced. Now, one thing you'll just notice from this very first slide is you can like tell the Great Depression time period from the photos. Whenever you see people in the Great Depression, you often see them with these kind of upset faces, these depressed looks in when they're facing the camera. Everything seems dark and dreary and awful. Compare that to the way we looked at footage and photographs from the Roaring Twenties, where everybody was partying and having a good time. This is going to be the exact opposite of that. Now, where we begin in our notes is, as I said just a second ago, the Roaring Twenties. We need to remind ourselves, sorry, we need to remind ourselves about this Roaring Twenties time period where things are so glamorous and awesome and amazing, and it seems like a party atmosphere that's never ever going to end. Unfortunately, as we all know, the Roaring Twenties will come crashing down when the stock market crashes and the Great Depression begins. Now, one thing we learned the last class that we took notes was about kind of the different things that made the Roaring Twenties seem successful when you were living in the 1920s, but that when we look back, we realize this was actually leading us into the Great Depression. And the first thing we learned was that all three of the presidents of the 1920s were all three Republicans. What you got to remember is that Republicans during this time period believed in lowering taxes and being hands off with business, just letting businesses kind of do their own thing. We all remember that famous phrase, laissez faire. The problem with laissez-faire is when the government is too hands-off, businesses do awful things. And y'all, businesses in the 1920s, they seem to be making a ton of money. But when we see what happened with the Great Depression, we realize this was actually what caused and led us into the Great Depression. Now, one sign that things are not going so well in the 1920s is we start to see consumerism, where people are buying more and more stuff in the beginning of the 1920s. But by the mid to late 1920s, we start to see this problem of overproduction and underconsumption. These are the first things you're going to write down on your notes. Overproduction means factories are producing way too much stuff. They're producing way too many products that can't be purchased fast enough. Y'all, you got to remember this was the time period where the assembly line was introduced to the country. This assembly line was great for increasing efficiency, but when you start building up all these factories using the assembly line, before you know it, you have overproduction, too many goods, too much stuff being produced, and then you mix that with underconsumption. The fact that by the end of the decade, people stopped buying stuff. It wasn't really in the beginning of the decade, people are buying, all the new appliances and new cars and new clothes. And by the time we get to the end of the decade, you start to see all that slowing down. And that is not a good mix to have overproduction and underconsumption. Now, last week, when we did our 1920s politics chart, we also talked about the rise of credit in America. What we have when we see the credit system is people are starting to buy things they can't actually afford. They're putting it on credit with the promise that they'll pay it off over time, plus a little bit extra interest. Y'all, the problem is if everybody starts doing this and then all of a sudden you lose your job, how are you going to continue to make those payments that you're signed up for? So, what we start to see is many Americans are using credit to live beyond their means. That means they're living and buying things that they can't actually afford. They're living in homes they can't actually pay for. They're driving cars that they buy on credit. They're even buying on credit things like clothes and appliances. The promise is they'll pay off the credit over time. But again, what's going to happen if people all of a sudden lose their jobs or can't find work or, God forbid, the economy crashes? So, this is the first major cause of the Depression. Again, this just shows you how many people were buying things on credit. 80% of all radios and 60% of all cars were bought on credit, meaning people didn't have the money to afford these products, but they bought them anyway with the promise to pay it off over time. Now, the next problem is something we've learned about before: wealth inequality. This idea that there are a few people in society who are so rich making a ton of money, while most people are poor and barely able to survive. So there are many poor and very few rich in the 1920s. 70% of the population is considered poor. Y'all, that means they don't really have any extra money to spend. So that means 30% of the population has to do like all the spending. They have to buy all the extra appliances, all the extra cars, all the extra clothes. This is why it's going to truly hurt the economy when a huge chunk of the population doesn't have enough money, barely has enough to survive, but definitely doesn't have enough to spend anything extra. Now, one of the big issues is workers. Workers during this time are not being taken care of. I know we've talked about the problems for workers, the long hours, the low pay, the unsafe conditions, and the child labor. Well, one of the biggest problems, like we said, is the low pay. Wages during this time could be as little as 20 to 25 cents an hour. Even the best jobs, like if you work for the Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford made a deal that he said it's $5 a day. You work 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., I'll give you $5 a day. Y'all, that is not very much money. You're talking about a rate of less than 50 cents an hour. But even this, $5 a day, is considered a good job during this time period. Unfortunately, not everybody even gets the bare minimum $5 a day. And I thought teachers were paid poorly. So that is the second cause of the Great Depression. The third, and probably the most important, in my opinion, is the stock market. What is going on in the stock market in the 1920s is called a boom. The stock market boomed throughout the 1920s. And people wanted to invest in this stock market so much, they even went into debt. Y'all, if you don't know the word debt, debt means you borrowed money. You took someone else's money with the promise to pay it back. You're now in their debt. Y'all, during the 1920s, everyone's investing in the stock market. It's often known as get rich quick syndrome, meaning everybody thinks if you just throw all your money in the stock market, the stocks will just keep going up and up and up. And before you know it, you'll be rich and you'll never have to work again. Get rich quick syndrome. It's so bad that, like I said, people are borrowing money. They're going into debt to buy stocks. This is called buying on margins. Everybody needs to do me a favor and put a star by this phrase in your notes: buying on margins. Because, y'all, this is a key phrase. And basically, what it means is people borrowed money to invest in the stock market. Their thought is if I borrow money and I invest in the stock market and the stock price goes up, I can cash out the stocks, I can pay back what I owe, and I get to keep all the rest for myself. People think this is the way you make money. You borrow, you invest, then you cash out, and you get to keep all what's left over. Unfortunately, they didn't anticipate the stock market to crash. The real problem is the stock market is not regulated. Nobody's watching the stock market. There's no government agency making sure that everything's on the up and up. So what we start to have is too much laissez-faire, too much of the government letting businesses just kind of run the show and do whatever it is they want to do. Now, y'all, this creates what's known as a bubble. And just like a bubble, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the stocks keep going up, and nobody's watching and nobody's watching. And then all of a sudden, the bubble pops and the whole stock market comes crashing down. Now, another word for this was called over speculation. In fact, if you wanted to, somewhere on your notes under where it says stock market speculation, if you wanted to put the phrase over speculation, y'all, over speculation just means too many people investing in the stock market. Too many people are just throwing every dollar they have. They don't even know what stocks they're buying or why they buy them. Everybody just is part of this get rich quick syndrome. So I think I already explained buying on margins, but let's make sure you understand it. So if there is a stock that's worth $100, you can buy on margins. You can pay part of it. You can go into debt. So you pay $10 and you borrow the other $90. Your thought process is, okay, well, if the stock price goes up, I'll cash out, I'll pay back the money that I owe that guy, and then I get to keep all the rest for myself. The problem is stocks fall. Stock prices go down. At first, the stock was worth $100. What are you going to do if that stock you bought for $100, by the way, you owe $90 on that stock? What if that stock goes from $100 to $50? Well, now you cash out, you got 50 bucks, you still owe somebody 40. What if it goes even worse than that? What if it goes all the way from 100 down to $5? It just absolutely crashes. You see how this is going to be a huge problem for the Great Depression? So, the spark that triggered the Great Depression, and we're now on the next page of your notes, the spark that triggered the Great Depression is known as Black Tuesday. Y'all, on October 29th, 1929, the stock market tumbles and crashes. Now, let me be very honest here. Technically, this began on the Thursday before October 29th, 1929. On that Thursday, which they called Black Thursday, the stock market began to crash. But on Friday, the stock market kind of rebounded a little bit. People were kind of recovering. But then the weekend happens, and there's no stock market trading over the weekend. Monday, it starts to slide a little bit, but Black Tuesday is where we see the stock market truly crash and just fall off a cliff. Y'all, over the course of these stock market crashing, the country loses $30 billion. Just poof, overnight, $30 billion that this country thought they had is just gone because of the stock market crash. Now, people begin to panic during this time. Sorry. People begin to panic during this time. They start to freak out. Somebody described it as almost like a bomb dropping on the city of New York because it truly did affect people in like the way a bomb would going off would. Now, speculators who bought on margins, who borrowed money to buy stocks, now could not pay off their debts. Now that the stocks are basically worthless, anybody who bought on margins is now in huge amounts of debt, and this is going to add to the problems of the Depression. This is a picture of the New York Stock Exchange. Now, the next thing we have is called the run on the banks. After the crash, people tried to withdraw their money. Y'all think about this logically. If you're hearing over the radio or you see in the newspaper that the stock market is crashing and everybody's losing their fortunes, you got to go get your cash. You want the physical paper money in your hands. Well, the problem is we keep all of our money in banks. Now, here's a dirty little secret about banks, y'all. When you put your money in the bank, you think they like take your $100 that you deposit and they put a $100 bill back in the vault. They don't actually do that. You deposit a $100 bill, they take about $25 of that and put it in the safe. The other $75 they use to make more money. They use to sell stocks. They use it to give people housing mortgages or to give people business loans. The idea is banks don't have all of our money back in their safes. So when everybody shows up to the bank all at the same time wanting to withdraw their money, the banks end up running out of cash. It's called the run on the banks. Literally, people ran to the banks. I don't know, some of you are trying to picture Mr. A running right now and you're laughing, but hey, that's mean. Y'all, the run on the banks, sorry, the run on the banks is when everybody goes to get their bank or their money out of the bank at the same time. And when the banks run out of money, the banks fail. Y'all, in just the ending parts of 1929, 641 banks fail. In 1930, 1,350 banks fail. In 1931, another 1,700 banks fail. Do you understand how this is just people's money just vanishing? So when banks cannot produce money for all their customers, the banks failed. Thousands of people lost their savings. It doesn't matter if you've got $50,000 in the bank. If everybody runs to the bank at the same time, maybe the first few people through the door get all of their money. The rest, the bank kind of just shrugs their shoulders and says, "Sorry, we're out. We failed." Y'all, this is going to add to the Great Depression. Not only is the stock market crashing and basically worthless, but now your bank has failed and led to the collapse of thousands of businesses. Now people are going to start losing their jobs. A lot of times people describe the Great Depression as a perfect storm where everything that is bad that can happen is going to happen. Now, the next one is problems for farmers. This is kind of a strange thing, but during the 1920s, when everybody else is seeing the stock market go up and the economy go up and businesses making so much money, farmers were already struggling. Farmers were struggling during this time because there was a decline in the demand for agricultural goods. Y'all, people started buying different things. There started to be refrigerators that could make food last longer. So farmers started to see that their food and their product that they were growing and creating on their farms wasn't making as much money. Also, farmers took out huge loans in the 1920s and weren't able to pay them back. So many people had their farms foreclosed. And if you don't know what that means, if you take out a loan from the bank against your farm, if, as long as you keep paying back your loan, you own your property. But if you stop paying back that loan, the bank comes in and takes that property away from you. It's called foreclosure. This is kind of the scene for many farmers during this time, a foreclosure. Now, again, I called this a perfect storm, what's happening during the Great Depression. Because as bad as things are for farmers, they're going to get even worse during the Great Depression. As if the stock market crashing wasn't bad enough, or the run on the banks, or the people losing their jobs or losing their savings, as if all of that wasn't bad enough, Mother Nature decides to throw the United States of America a natural disaster. This natural disaster will be known in history as the Dust Bowl, or sometimes called the Great Dust Bowl. Y'all, look at some of these photos. This giant dust storm up here is so massive, it's bigger than the telephone poles. Y'all, this tractor here, that is maybe what, 5 feet, these wheels, is buried under sand and dust. This is going to destroy a lot of farmland in the country. So, as if things weren't bad enough, this Dust Bowl is also going to cause a food shortage during the 1930s. Now, there are two things that cause the Great Dust Bowl. The first is over farming. Basically, that just means farmers are using the same plot of land over and over and over again. Now, I know none of us here are farmers, but what you got to understand about farming, y'all, is you can't use the same plot of land over and over again. You dry out the soil, you drain of it, all of its nutrients. So farmers know if you grow something, for 5 years on this plot of land, then for the next like 2 years, you need to move your crops somewhere else and kind of give that dirt some time to recover and kind of recuperate. But the other thing that causes it is drought. And this is the biggest thing, y'all. Drought means little to no rainfall. In fact, if right next to the word drought, you wanted to write down the phrase no rain or little rain, that would make you understand drought means there wasn't a lot of rain happening during this time period, which made this dust bowl that much worse. Huge chunks of the country's farmland is destroyed. If you didn't have your farm foreclosed upon and but somehow the Dust Bowl comes in and wipes you out, now you've got to give up your farm, you got to move somewhere else where there's a possibility for you to survive. So a lot of people begin moving out west. Farmers in the plains are going to be called Okies and Arkies, and they're going to leave their farms and search for work out on the west coast. By the way, if you've never heard of a book called Of Mice and Men, this is kind of about that story. It's about two brother farmers who move out to the West Coast trying to find a place for them to work because the middle part of this country is kind of wiped out by this dust bowl. Now, let's talk about what life is like when the Depression actually begins, when people are truly having to live through this Great Depression. First off, 12 million people unemployed. That is a lot of people without jobs, without paychecks, without a way to feed their families. Americans begin to lack confidence in the future. And y'all, I know that seems like it's not that big a deal. It really is. If Americans don't believe in the future of their country, why would they ever buy a house? Why would they ever go out and start a business? Why would they ever do anything that would, improve their lives if they don't think the future is going to be good or prosperous at all? So this is going to be a reason that the Depression is going to drag on until the 1940s. And I know we think of the Great Depression as affecting the United States, and it does, but it doesn't just affect America, y'all. This affects the entire world. Turn your page over. World trade falls off by 40%. Meaning, if we were trading with a country, let's say we used to sell, I don't know, 100 heads of cattle to Canada every year. Well, now we're only selling them 60 heads of cattle every year. Y'all, that is a huge chunk of business just poof, gone during this time period because not only is America affected by the Depression, but the rest of the world is too. Now, one of the bad parts about the Depression is the fact that some of the first things that people tried to do to fix the Depression actually end up making it worse. One of the first things our country tries to do to make the Depression a little bit easier for us is they create what are called tariffs. So, to encourage citizens to buy from US companies, the government passed new tariffs. Now, this is actually a word that's popped up in our political talking points in recent years, but a tariff is essentially an extra fee or an extra tax on anything not made in America. So, if you buy a Ford automobile made in America, it's $1,000. But if you buy a German BMW made in Germany, it's $1,000 plus the tariff of an extra $250 tax. You see how this is trying to make Americans buy American made products? Why would you buy the foreign stuff if it's so much more expensive? Here's the problem, y'all. Because we put tariffs on stuff made in other countries being sold in America, they put their own tariffs on American goods being sold in their countries. So if we sell, the Ford automobile for $1,000 here, but the BMW in America costs $1,250, well, in Germany, it's the opposite. In Germany, they'll sell you the BMW car for $1,000, but if you try and buy a Ford automobile from America, they charge you 1,250. You see how this is all just kind of making the situation worse? Nobody's going to buy products if these tariffs are making things unaffordable. So these are the big causes of the Great Depression. These are the things that kind of add to what I have called the perfect storm. Now, here are the big facts, and I'm going to leave it on here for a little bit because there's a lot of information for you to write down. And I know there's a lot of numbers, but you're going to understand how awful these numbers truly are. 25,000 banks will fail. Y'all, you got to imagine each bank probably has dozens, maybe hundreds of customers. So that is thousands upon thousands of people whose banks have now failed, whose money is simply gone. But it's not just the fact that your money is gone when the bank fails. It's the fact that the bank isn't able to invest in any other businesses. Y'all, I know you're not old enough to start your own business yet, but maybe one day you want to. If you ever want to start your own business, you'll have to go to a bank and ask for a loan. I want to make my own ice cream shop. Well, I need to go to a bank and borrow $500,000 to make that ice cream shop. The problem is there's no banks for you to go to borrow that money. So then there's no investments being made. So there's no new businesses being opened. Do you see how this kind of all snowballs into more and more problems for us to deal with? Now, speaking of businesses, 90,000 businesses will fail. Y'all, you got to understand, this is how people get their paychecks every week. They go to work. They go work at grocery stores and post offices and schools and, they go, work at a movie theater. But if all the businesses in America are failing, if they're closing their doors, where's everybody going to go to work? How is everybody going to survive during this time period? It's going to be rather difficult. 25% unemployment. Y'all, that means one out of every four Americans doesn't have a job. One out of every four Americans doesn't know when their next paycheck is coming in or how they're probably going to feed their families. And even worse than the 25% unemployment, 40% of home mortgages will go into default. Y'all, I know you're not old enough to own a home, but one day when you want to go own a home, you'll have to go to a bank and apply for what's called a mortgage. A mortgage is essentially a giant bank loan. Now, the deal with a mortgage is simple, right? You get a mortgage from a bank. If I want to buy a house for, yeah, right, $150,000, you can't find a house for that anymore. But let's say I wanted to buy a house for $150,000. I get a mortgage, a loan from a bank for $150,000. The deal I make with the bank is as long as I make my payments every month, I get to keep living in my house. I own my home. But if I start not paying my bills, if I don't send the check to the bank every month, my mortgage will go into default and they will eventually foreclose. They will kick me out of my home, dump me, my family, and all my possessions out on the street. And y'all, it's a really difficult thing to have to deal with because, again, one-fourth of the country doesn't have jobs. How are they going to pay their mortgages? Where are they going to live? Where are they going to sleep? How are they going to take care of their families? We are seeing record levels of poverty during the Great Depression. So many people are living basically to a situation where they can barely feed themselves and keep themselves alive. Now, this is what that unemployment looks like in the United States during this time. You'll see it kind of skyrockets at the beginning at 25%, but eventually it does kind of go down. But y'all, we will not get back to the normal levels of unemployment that we're used to in this country until the middle of World War II. In fact, a dirty little secret about the Great Depression is that World War II is one of the biggest things that gets us out of the Depression. World War II got a bunch of people back to work building bombs and guns and tanks and aircraft. So, as bad as World War II is going to be and how awful it is that millions of people are going to die in that war, it did kind of drag us and the rest of the world out of the Depression. Now, what about the people? What are people dealing with during this time period? What are their lives like? Well, we already kind of talked about farmers. Farmers were already feeling the effects of the Depression even before the Depression even happened. Many of them had their prices of crops go down. Many of them had their farms foreclosed upon. And then, of course, as if all that wasn't bad enough, we also got the Dust Bowl. People couldn't afford luxuries. Y'all, it wasn't just you couldn't afford basic things. You couldn't afford any extravagance. So if you were a business, I don't know, if you were like a fur coat manufacturer, you used to make expensive fur coats. Well, guess what? People can't even afford to buy bread for their families. They can't afford to keep the lights on or the heat on in their homes. How's anybody going to go out and buy a luxury like a fur coat? So this is really going to affect businesses. Banks, we already talked about, could not pay out any more money. People couldn't pay their taxes. So, y'all, I know we've talked about this before. Taxes come out of everybody's paycheck to pay for schools and fire departments and police departments and the roads and paving and the government and the military. So, if people don't have jobs, You can't take tax money out of their paychecks. If you don't get tax money out of their paychecks, things like schools and post offices and fire departments are going to end up shutting down. There are certain neighborhoods, especially like certain neighborhood schools, where the whole neighborhood has kind of lost their job. And so, since there's no tax dollars coming in, guess what? The school's got to shut down and close. By the way, where does that leave your children? Where are they going to go if all the schools are shut down? Many families become homeless and have to live in what are called shanties, or essentially, they're basically shacks made of, scrap pieces of wood. And again, I know I already said this, but y'all, it's in every photo. Whenever you look at pictures from the Great Depression, you see people suffering. You don't see them partying and having a good time and going out and enjoying the nightlife. That was the visions of the Roaring Twenties, not the awful terribleness of the Great Depression. Now, people during this time period, y'all, they're going to get so desperate that we're going to start seeing the rise of what are called bread lines. Now, it is exactly what it's described. It is waiting in line for free bread. The idea is if you don't have a job, you don't have work to go to, the best thing you can do to help provide for your family is go beg somebody to give you some free food. The government is trying to give out as much free food as they possibly can, but there's not enough food to go around. So you wait in these bread lines for hours and hours because, hey, if I don't have a job to go afford a paycheck, I can at least spend my time trying to get food for my children. Y'all, this gets really desperate. Check out this photo. This is a bread line in New York City on Christmas Day, when you would normally expect families to be at home celebrating, having a good time, maybe opening up presents. Y'all, look at how this line goes. It goes down, sorry, it goes down and around the block. That is an unbelievable amount of people just standing in ride or line begging for free food. Now, here's the worst part about bread lines, y'all. There's a possibility that you stand in a bread line for hours and hours and hours. You hope and you hope and you hope you'll get food at the end. And then when you get there, there's no food left. Now, look at this picture here, because I think this picture is like the ultimate irony of this time period. These people, American citizens, are standing in a bread line begging for free food while standing in front of a poster that says, World's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And you see the mom and dad smiling, the kids in the back, even the dog with his head hanging out the window looks like he's having a good time. So, y'all, do you see the irony here? You see how crazy this situation is? Americans are begging for free food, standing in front of a poster that says, America's got the highest standard of living. And that doesn't really seem to be the case for these people here. This picture is a police guard standing, or a police officer standing guard outside of a bank. Y'all, when this run on the bank situation happened, a lot of people lost their savings, but even the banks that still survived, people threatened to burn the bank down and, kill the tellers. And it like created a real security situation that police officers had to get involved with. Ooh, this is a common sight during the Great Depression. There are so many unemployed people that they're all begging for jobs. Basically, if you're a factory that's still in business, there are so many people willing to work that you kind of just get to walk out every day and go, okay, I need 5 people. And they all start raising their hand. Oh, pick me, pick me. You pick one, two, three, four, five. Everybody else go home. I don't have anything for you. This is kind of the desperate situation. If you're one of these poor people of this time period, you're hoping and praying you get picked just to go to work. Y'all, how funny is that? How many of us wish we didn't have to work? These people were hoping and praying for the opportunity just to go to work. Now, I know I already said this, but unemployment leads to foreclosures on people's homes. People become homeless and they start living on the streets. Now, I know we picture today homeless people living in tents, but there isn't really a lot of tents back during this time period. What you have instead are essentially shacks. What you've got is these random pieces of wood and fence and random pieces of scrap metal that are all put together to kind of keep the wind out and keep the sun and keep the rain out. But y'all, people are desperate. They're willing to do just about anything to survive. And I know I've already mentioned that there's also a food shortage during this time period. Little content warning on this next one if you're a little squeamish. This is a picture of a hobo, a person living on the streets, eating turtle soup. Y'all, people will grab anything to eat during this time. Dogs and cats during this Great Depression are not pets, they're possible meals. Rats, as gross as it sounds, maybe need to be the meat you add to your stew. Turtle soup is not uncommon. By the way, the most extreme example I've heard of people being, desperate for food is people eating what is called leather broth soup. So I don't know if you know this, but leather is made from cow hides. So like your leather belt, your leather boots, your leather wallet, it is made from the hide of a cow, the cow skin. If you put cowhide or leather in boiling water and let it boil for a long time, the nutrients from the leather seeps into the water and you can drink the leather broth soup like it's soup and it will, I mean, it's not going to taste great and it's not going to be very much, but it will maybe help keep you alive. Whenever I talked about homes being foreclosed upon, this is the image you got to picture in your mind. Families being evicted, the women, the children, the husbands, the mothers and fathers being kicked out onto the street with all of their worldly possessions. By the way, how quickly do you think people come by and steal all that stuff after it's sitting outside for that long? And again, it's just this common sight. Many people waiting in unemployment lines, hoping for a job. Everybody is desperate just to get back to work. Now, our president, when the Great Depression begins, is President Herbert Hoover. And y'all, Herbert Hoover is a Republican. So you got to remember, this guy believes in laissez faire. This guy believes in not having the government get involved, having the government stay out of it. The problem is, when the whole country is suffering, we need the government to act. We need them to do something. President Herbert Hoover, in the beginning of the Depression, thinks we can overcome the Depression through rugged individualism. Basically, he's saying, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, tie up your laces, get out to work, and we can figure this out. We'll all be okay. Y'all, he's being very optimistic. I get what he's trying to do, trying to encourage the American people that everything's going to be all right. But if you're just sitting there telling people everything's going to be all right, but not actually doing anything to make their lives better, that's kind of tough for people to understand and believe, hey, everything's going to be fine now. Again, he is one of these presidents who believes in laissez-faire. He believes in preventing government intervention. He doesn't want the government to come out and start intervening and doing things. He kind of wants the government to be hands off and hopefully the economy can fix itself. Now, in the beginning, as I said, President Herbert Hoover thinks we can get through this on our own. He encourages people to volunteer. He encourages organizations like the YMCA to help with food drives and clothing drives and, take care of the children with extra child care. But y'all, let's be honest. Charities, and remember that word philanthropy, can only go so far. We need the government to start doing something. Now, even though President Herbert Hoover will be slow to react, eventually he does start taking some actions. In the beginning, he wants to avoid government intervention, but by the end of his presidency, he realizes this isn't working, so he switches strategies. One of the first things he does is he issues relief checks. Y'all, relief checks are just a fancy way of saying the government sends everybody a check. Basically, the government says, hey, we know you don't have any money. We know you don't have jobs. You know you're not getting paychecks. So here's a check for you. It's not very much money, but the idea is this should give you some relief. If you're looking at your bank account and there's $0, well, here's a government check for $100. We know it's not very much, but hopefully that'll help you do something. Then the government starts doing things that is going to be what the government needs to do to get us out of the depression. The government begins finding things for people to do, finding jobs. So the Reconstruction Finance Corp. Y'all, this was all about loaning money to failing businesses. Basically, the government acts as a bank. Instead of you going to the bank around the corner and asking for $500,000 to open up your ice cream shop, now you can go to the government and ask for the loan to open up your ice cream shop. The other thing that the government's going to start doing is creating things like the Hoover Dam. Y'all, the Hoover Dam is a giant construction project that the government does during this time period, obviously named after Herbert Hoover. But y'all, the Hoover Dam is an example of how you can get people back to work as long as the government is the one finding the jobs for them to do. Let's get, 5,000 construction workers and get them back to work building a Hoover Dam. That way they all get paychecks. And also, it doubles as a good thing for the US government because dams are really valuable and they create electricity. Now, obviously, a lot of people are really upset with President Herbert Hoover. A lot of people look at him like he's a big old idiot for letting the Great Depression get as bad as it is. And so what we begin to see is the rise of what are called Hoovervilles. Now, y'all, this is just a funny word that people use to describe these like shacks, these homeless tents, these homeless shacks where all the homeless people kind of gather together and live in these like homeless communities. And they start to call these little towns Hoovervilles. You get the joke here? The idea of a Hooverville is that it's President Herbert Hoover's fault. The reason we're all living in a shack, the reason we're all living in tents, the reason we're all living on the street is because of President Herbert Hoover. So what are we going to call this little town of all these shacks put together? We're going to call them Hoovervilles. And this just goes to show you how flimsy and terrible a lot of these shacks were. Y'all, some of these shacks are random pieces of fencing or random pieces of wood or scrap pieces of metal just put together. Let me ask you, how do you think this shack that you're looking at here will stand up to even just a 15-mile-an-hour wind? Or what do you think happens during the first lightning strike or thunderstorm? People will grab anything. They'll pull apart, like I said, fencing and things like that to make these shack towns. And y'all, if you thought what I asked you about this shack surviving, a storm or lightning strikes or intense rain, what do you think life is like in these shacks in the middle of Central Park, New York City? In the middle of a blizzard, how warm do you think these places are? A lot of people are going to die during this time period from illnesses that they wouldn't have died from if they, had a good place to sleep at night and a warm fire to keep them warm and food in their bellies and maybe a visit to the doctor every now and then. But because people are so desperate, because people are living in shacks, because they can't afford medicine and they can't afford food, people are going to die of starvation, of disease. One thing you got to understand is when the economy goes down, it doesn't just affect people's money, it affects people's overall health and lives. Now, let's go down to the very bottom, the election of 1932. After we elect back to back to back Republicans in the 1920s, in 1932, the people of America decide it's time to change. Instead of electing another Republican, we switch it to Democrat. Y'all, look at how one-sided this electoral college vote is. Pretty much every state has got the idea in their heads, hey, we need to elect a Democrat. Democrats haven't had control in a while. Maybe they have a solution to this problem. But it's not just that they're voting Democrat. Y'all, they are voting for FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt. So you can kind of see it here. The F for FD Roosevelt stands for Franklin D. Roosevelt. And if you want to know, it's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, he takes over during the Great Depression. And it's not like he takes over and the very next day the Great Depression is over. In fact, we still have another 8 years of a depression to deal with. But a lot of people look at FDR and realize he's got an idea for how to get us out of the depression. He's got an idea for how we can fix this country and turn everything around. And one of the things we're going to talk about next class is that he needs to come up with his New Deal. His New Deal plan for getting us out of the Depression. One part of that New Deal, by the way, is getting the American people to start believing that everything's going to be okay. Reinstilling confidence in the American society, trying to make them feel like, hey, we're going to get through this, we're going to survive, and everything's going to be okay in the end. Because y'all, a lot of people during the Great Depression thought this was a depression that would never, ever be over with. Now, That is a large set of notes. Turn your page over to the very, very back. You see how it says on this page, draw the causes of the Great Depression chart? This is what I'm talking about. Hold on, don't get whiplash from how fast I'm moving here. This is what I want you to draw. So if Mr. Arnold or anybody else would like to pause the video here in a second, that would be just fine. That way everybody could get this done. But as always, it's my number one concern when I send you all out that you come back to me safe and sound. Y'all, be good for the sub. Be good for Mr. Arnold. Make sure you do these notes. Make sure you do your notes on Wednesday and Thursday. And y'all, or sorry, on Thursday and Friday, and make sure you take your last quiz of the entire semester. Be safe, be smart, be good, and I'll see everybody back on Monday. Have a great day, y'all. Bye bye.